I don't look like their mother, and they don't look like my children. When people see us together now, me, a black woman in my 60s, and my 4 grown children with their light brown hair and green eyes, they do the math and come up confused. But family isn't about matching features or shared bloodlines. It's about the choice to love someone so completely that you'd move heaven and earth to protect them. And that's exactly what they did for me. Chapter 1. 4 on the Porch. I've always believed that God sends us exactly what we need, exactly when we need it, even when we don't recognize the blessing at first. That stormy October night in 2003, when the rain was coming down so hard it sounded like pebbles hitting my tin roof, I thought I was just getting up to check the windows. I never imagined I was walking toward the moment that would change everything. My name is Lorraine Walker, and at 48, I'd grown comfortable with the quiet rhythms of my life here in Millbrook, Mississippi. 3 years had passed since I'd buried my husband, Marcus, after that terrible accident at the lumber mill, and I'd settled into a routine that felt safe, if lonely. Monday through Friday, I worked at Mount Olive Baptist Church, keeping the books and answering phones for Pastor Williams. Evenings, I'd sit on my front porch with a glass of sweet tea, watching the fireflies dance in my small yard and listening to the distant sound of freight trains carrying their cargo to places I'd never see. The house Marcus and I had saved for, a modest 2-bedroom with white clapboard siding and a wraparound porch, felt too big for just me sometimes. We'd planned to fill those empty bedrooms with children of our own, but the Lord had different plans. After years of hoping and praying, we'd learned to find joy in other things. Marcus's weekend fishing trips, my vegetable garden, the young families at church who'd become like extended family to us. Now, on nights like this one, with thunder rolling across the delta and lightning splitting the darkness, I mostly felt grateful for a sturdy roof and walls that kept the weather out. I was settling into bed with my worn Bible, planning to read a psalm before sleep, when I heard something that made me pause. At first, I thought it was just the storm. Maybe a shutter had come loose or the old magnolia tree was scraping against the house again. But there it was again, a sound that didn't belong to wind or rain. It was softer, more human. I slipped on my robe and house shoes, grabbed the flashlight Marcus had always kept by the bed, and made my way to the front door. The porch light was on, casting a yellow glow through the sheets of rain, but I couldn't see anything unusual. I was about to go back inside when I heard it clearly. A small voice, maybe a child's, saying something I couldn't make out over the storm. "Hello?" I called out, stepping onto the porch, despite the rain that immediately started soaking through my slippers. "Is someone out there?" That's when I saw them. Huddled together under the far end of my porch, pressed back against the brick foundation like they were trying to disappear into the shadows, were 4 children. 4 little souls, soaked to the bone and shivering in clothes that looked like they'd been worn for days. The oldest boy, who couldn't have been more than 12, had his arms wrapped around the others, trying to shield them from the wind-driven rain that was finding its way under the porch. For a moment, I just stood there, my heart breaking at the sight. The boy looked up at me with eyes that were trying so hard to be brave, while the 3 smaller children, 2 girls and another boy, clung to him like he was their anchor in a storm much bigger than the weather. "Sweet Jesus," I whispered, and then louder, "Children, what are you doing out here in this weather?" The oldest boy tensed up, ready to run or fight. I could see it in his posture. "We're not causing trouble, ma'am," he said, his voice trying to sound older than his years. "We'll move on in the morning." Move on! I stepped closer, and in the flashlight's beam, I could see that the youngest, a little girl who couldn't have been more than 5, was burning with fever. Her small face was flushed, and she was barely conscious in the arms of what I assumed was her sister. Child, you're not moving anywhere tonight except into my house. No, ma'am, we're fine, the oldest boy insisted, but I could hear his teeth chattering. I've been around children enough to know when they're scared of adults, and these babies were terrified. Whatever had brought them to my porch in the middle of a Mississippi thunderstorm, they weren't going to trust easily. But that little one was sick, and trust would have to come later. I'm Miss Lorraine, I said gently, crouching down so I wasn't towering over them. And I don't know what brought you to my porch tonight, but I know the Lord doesn't send children into storms without sending someone to shelter them. Now I've got hot soup on the stove, dry clothes, and a warm house. You can tell me your story or not, that's up to you, but you're not spending another minute out in this weather. The boy looked at me for a long moment, weighing something I couldn't understand. Finally, the little girl with the fever whimpered softly, and his resolute cracked. Just for tonight, he said quietly. We'll leave first thing in the morning. I smiled at him, this child trying so hard to be a man. We'll see about that, sugar. For now, let's just get you warm and dry. As I helped gather those shivering children and ushered them into my house, I had no idea I was opening my door to the greatest blessing of my life. Chapter 2. Making a home out of nothing. The first thing I noticed when those children stepped into my living room was how they moved, like a pack of young wolves, staying close together, never letting their guard down. The oldest boy positioned himself between me and the others, his wet sneakers squeaking against my hardwood floor as he turned to keep me in sight while scanning for exits. Now then, I said softly, switching on the table lamp to chase away some of the shadows. Let's get you out of those wet clothes before you catch your death. The little one, the baby girl with the fever, was barely conscious, her head lolling against the shoulder of what I could now see was an older girl, maybe 10, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. We don't have other clothes, the older girl said matter-of-factly, her voice carrying a weariness that made my heart ache. Children shouldn't sound like that, like they'd already seen too much of the world's hard edges. Well, that's what we're going to fix, I replied, heading toward Marcus's old dresser. My husband was a small man, and I've got some of his old shirts that'll work as nightgowns for now. I pulled out 4 of Marcus's softest flannel shirts, the ones I couldn't bear to give away after he passed. Somehow, it felt right that they'd finally served their purpose again, protecting and warming people who needed shelter. While I gathered towels and dry socks, I watched the children from the corner of my eye. The oldest boy, I later learned his name was Caleb, never sat down, never relaxed. His brown eyes were old beyond his 12 years, constantly alert, ready for whatever danger he'd learned to expect from adults. His clothes were too small, outgrown, but carefully maintained, and I could see the pride in how he held himself, despite being scared and soaked. The girl holding the baby had positioned herself where she could see both the front door and the back hallway. Her name was Naomi, and even at 10, she carried herself like someone who had to grow up fast. Her dark hair was matted from the rain, but I could tell it had been braided carefully at some point. Someone had cared for her, even if that someone was no longer around. The middle boy, who couldn't have been more than 8, sat hunched in the corner of my sofa, trying to make himself invisible. His breathing was labored, asthma, I suspected, and every few minutes he'd glance up at Caleb as if seeking permission to exist. This was Joshua, though I wouldn't know his name until later. What I knew immediately was that this child had been hurt, probably more than once. And then there was Grace. Even burning with fever, even limp with exhaustion, she was beautiful. All dark curls and long eyelashes, probably 5 years old but small for her age. She hadn't spoken a word since I'd found them, but she hummed. Soft, wordless melodies that seemed to comfort not just herself, but the others too. "Come on now," I said, spreading the towels on the coffee table. "Let's get you dried off and into something warm. Then we'll see about some food." That's when Caleb finally spoke up, his voice carefully controlled. "We appreciate the kindness, ma'am, but we can't pay you back. We don't have any money." I stopped folding towels and looked at this child, this little boy trying so hard to be the man of his makeshift family, and felt my heart break just a little more. "Sugar, did I ask you for money?" "No, ma'am, but..." "Then don't worry about what you can't do. Worry about getting warm and dry." I handed him a towel and one of Marcus's old shirts. "The bathroom's down that hall if you want privacy to change. The girls can change out here. I'll step into the kitchen." For a moment I thought he might refuse, but Grace whimpered softly, and Naomi's face showed the exhaustion she had been trying to hide. Whatever walls these children had built to protect themselves, their love for each other was stronger. While they changed, I heated up the pot of vegetable soup I'd made earlier and sliced thick pieces of cornbread. Simple food, but filling. I could hear quiet whispers from the living room. Naomi coaxing Joshua into dry clothes. Caleb checking Grace's fever with the back of his hand, the way I'd seen mothers do. When I returned with the food, they were huddled together on my sofa, swimming in Marcus's oversized flannel shirts. Grace was curled in Naomi's lap, finally sleeping peacefully, while Joshua sat pressed against Caleb's side. They looked like what they were, exhausted children who had been carrying burdens too heavy for their small shoulders. "Now then," I said, setting the tray on the coffee table, "I expect you to eat every bit of this soup. And while you're eating, you don't have to tell me anything you don't want to, but I want you to know something." I sat down in Marcus's old recliner, close enough to offer comfort, but far enough away that they wouldn't feel trapped. "Tonight, you belong here. Tomorrow, we'll figure out what comes next. But right now, you're safe, you're warm, and you're home." Naomi looked up at me then, those sharp eyes searching my face for the lies she probably learned to expect. "You don't even know us." I smiled at her, this fierce little guardian who probably sacrificed more than I could imagine to protect the others. "No, baby, I don't know your names yet, or where you came from, or what brought you to my porch in that storm. But I know what matters. You take care of each other, you're brave enough to keep going when things get hard, and you found your way to someone who has room in her heart and her home." As I watched them slowly begin to eat, saw the way their shoulders gradually relaxed and their eyes grew heavy with the kind of exhaustion that comes from finally feeling safe, I whispered a prayer of gratitude. I thought my days of nurturing and protecting were over. I was wrong. These four had found me, but sitting there in my quiet living room, watching them discover what it felt like to be warm and fed and wanted, I realized something important. They were about to save me just as much as I was going to save them. Chapter 3. Love in Small Things. The morning after the storm brought sunshine so bright it seemed like God's way of blessing our new beginning. I woke to the sound of whispered voices in my living room and the smell of coffee. Someone had figured out how to work my old percolator. When I padded out in my robe, I found Caleb standing guard by the front window while Naomi sat cross-legged on the floor, braiding Grace's hair with gentle fingers. Joshua was curled up on the sofa, breathing easier than he had the night before. "Morning, babies," I said softly, not wanting to startle them. Caleb spun around, that protective tension immediately flooding back into his thin shoulders. "We make coffee," Naomi said, lifting her chin like she expected to be scolded. "We know how to clean up after ourselves." I can see that. And I could. They'd washed their bowls from the night before, folded the towels I'd given them, and even attempted to make the sofa cushions look neat. These children had been taught manners by someone who cared about them. The question that had kept me up half the night was, where was that someone now? Over breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast that disappeared faster than I'd ever seen food vanish, I started learning their real names and bits of their story. Not all of it, mind you. Children who'd been through what these four had obviously experienced don't open up all at once. But enough to confirm what my heart already knew. They needed me as much as I needed them. Caleb was indeed 12, and he'd been taking care of the others for months. His real name was Caleb Mitchell, and the way he said it, careful and proud, told me that someone had taught him his name mattered. Naomi was 10, sharp as a tack, and had apparently been keeping them fed by what she carefully called finding things people didn't need anymore. Joshua, 8, had asthma that got worse when he was scared, which explained the wheezing that broke my heart. And Grace, sweet baby Grace, was 5 and hadn't spoken a word to anyone but her makeshift siblings in over a year. "Where are your parents, honey?" I asked gently, pouring more orange juice into Joshua's glass. The silence that fell over the table was answer enough. These weren't children who'd gotten lost or run away from loving homes. These were babies who'd been failed by every adult who should have protected them. "We take care of each other," Caleb said firmly. "We don't need—" "I know you do, and you've done a beautiful job. Look how well you've kept everyone safe and together. But Sugar, you're 12 years old. You shouldn't have to carry that weight all by yourself." That first week, I watched them slowly unfold like flowers that had been closed up tight against the hard frost. Naomi helped me sort clothes donations at the church, her quick mind cataloging everything we had and everything we needed. She had opinions about everything, which vegetables to plant in my garden, how to organize my kitchen cabinets for better efficiency, why my old washing machine was making that funny noise. She was right about all of it. Joshua was quieter, but he had gentle hands and a way with living things. He spent hours helping me tend my tomato plants, and I noticed his breathing got easier when he was working in the soil. The boy had been scared so long he'd forgotten how to relax, but dirt under his fingernails and the satisfaction of watching things grow seemed to remind him it was possible to feel safe. Caleb remained watchful, protective, ready to grab his siblings and run if the other shoe dropped. But I caught moments when his guard slipped, when he'd laugh at something Naomi said, or when he'd carefully help Joshua with his inhaler without making a big fuss about it. This child had been forced to grow up too fast, but there was still a boy in there, buried under all that responsibility. And Grace, oh, Grace was like watching a butterfly emerge from a cocoon so slowly, you almost missed it happening. She still didn't speak, but her humming grew louder, more confident. She'd sit on my kitchen counter while I cooked, swinging her little legs and humming melodies I'd never heard before. Sometimes I'd catch myself humming along, and she'd smile, the first real smiles I'd seen from any of them. It was Grace who first tested whether I'd keep my promise about them belonging here. 3 weeks after they'd arrived, I found her in my bedroom, holding the framed photograph of Marcus and I from our wedding day. Her small finger was tracing his face with the careful reverence children show precious things. "That's my husband, Marcus," I told her, sitting on the bed beside her. "He died a while back, but he would have loved you children so much." She looked up at me with those dark, serious eyes and whispered, the first word I'd heard her speak, "Daddy?" My heart nearly broke right there. He would have been proud to be your daddy, baby girl, and I'm proud to be your mama if you'll have me. That's when she said it, clear as a bell. Mama. Not Miss Lorraine like the others had taken to calling me, just Mama. Said with such trust and longing that I had to excuse myself to cry happy tears in the bathroom. But it wasn't all easy. The community had opinions about a black widow woman raising 4 children who weren't hers. Miss Henderson down the road made sure to mention at the grocery store that some people bite off more than they can chew. Deacon Mills pulled me aside after church to ask if I'd thought this through properly. The children heard these whispers, saw the stares. One evening, Naomi asked me straight out, "Are you going to send us away because people are talking?" I looked at these 4 precious souls, Caleb helping Joshua with his homework, Grace humming while she colored, Naomi watching my face for any sign of rejection, and felt something fierce and protective rise up in my chest. Baby, let me tell you something about what other people think. There's only one opinion that matters when it comes to my family, and that's God's. And God doesn't make mistakes. He sent you forward to my porch in that storm for a reason, and no amount of gossip is going to change what He's decided. I looked around at all of them then, these children who'd made my quiet house ring with laughter and purpose again. You want to know what I tell people when they ask why I'm raising children that aren't mine? I said, my voice strong and sure. I tell them because somebody's got to, and that somebody is me. The way their faces lit up like I just hung the moon and stars told me everything I needed to know. We were a family now, no matter what anybody else thought, and families protect each other.
Chapter 4. Growing Pains. Time has a way of changing children faster than you can keep up with. And before I knew it, my babies were teenagers with voices that cracked and attitudes that could shift like Mississippi weather. Caleb shot up 6 inches in 1 year, eating everything in sight and outgrowing clothes faster than I could sew them. At 17, he was all sharp angles and righteous anger, ready to take on anyone who looked sideways at our family. That's how the trouble started. It was a Saturday morning in late spring, and I'd sent Caleb to Morrison's grocery store to pick up supplies for Sunday dinner. We were expecting the church ladies for our monthly potluck planning meeting, and I needed to make a good impression. These women had slowly warmed up to our unusual family over the years, but I still felt like I was walking on eggshells sometimes. Caleb had been gone too long when Deputy Barnes pulled up in my driveway with my boy in the back of his patrol car. My heart dropped to my feet as I watched them both get out, Caleb with his head held high despite the handcuffs, and Deputy Barnes looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Miss Lorraine," Deputy Barnes said, tipping his head, "I'm afraid I've got to bring Caleb in. He got into an altercation at Morrison's." "What kind of altercation?" I kept my voice steady, but inside I was shaking. "Well, ma'am, Mr. Morrison called it assault, said Caleb attacked him unprovoked." I looked at my boy, this young man I'd raised to be respectful and kind, and saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not anger, but hurt. Deep, cutting hurt. "That's true, Caleb?" I hit him. His voice quiet but firm. "I won't lie about that, but it wasn't unprovoked." After Deputy Barnes left with Caleb, I drove straight to Morrison's store. The old man was behind the counter sporting a bruised jaw and an expression that could sour milk. "Mr. Morrison," I said, keeping my voice level, "I need to know what happened." He looked at me with those cold blue eyes and said, "That boy of yours has no respect. I was just telling Mrs. Patterson here how unnatural it is, a colored woman trying to raise white children. Said you probably just keep them for the government checks." My hands clenched into fists at my sides, but I kept my voice steady. "And what did my son say to that?" "He said I was a liar and a racist, got all uppity about it." Mrs. Patterson, who'd been standing quietly by the canned goods, cleared her throat. "Harold, that's not exactly how it happened." Morrison's face reddened. "Stay out of this, Betty." But Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her chin raised in defiance of a man who'd been bullying this town for years. He called Lorraine terrible names, boy names I won't repeat. Called those children unwanted trash, said the only reason a decent Christian woman would take them in was her money or because she was... She stopped, looking at me with apologetic eyes. "Because she was what, Mrs. Patterson?" "Because she was too ugly and desperate to find herself a man." The silence in that store was thick enough to cut with a knife. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not anger, but a deep, bone-deep weariness. After 5 years of proving ourselves, of showing this town that love didn't have boundaries, we were still just objects of gossip and suspicion. "I see," I said finally. "And my son hit you after you said these things." Morrison nodded, touching his jaw gingerly. I turned to Mrs. Patterson. "Would you mind telling Sheriff Williams exactly what you heard? Every word." 2 days later, Caleb came home. The charges were dropped after Mrs. Patterson and 2 other witnesses gave their statements. But something had changed in my boy. He moved through the house like a storm cloud, angry at a world that would always see us as something wrong. That evening, I found him on the back porch, staring out at the vegetable garden we'd planted together years ago. "You can't fight 'em all, Caleb," I said, settling beside him on the steps. "Why not?" His voice was raw with frustration. "Why should we have to prove we belong together? Why isn't love enough?" I thought about that question for a long time before answering. Love is enough, baby. But some people's hearts are so small they can't see it. That doesn't make our family any less real. He leaned against my shoulder like he used to when he was small. "I hate that they talk about you like that." "I know you do, but fighting them just makes them think they're right about us." "Then what do we do?" I wrapped my arm around this young man who'd appointed himself our family's protector and said, "We keep loving each other. We keep proving them wrong, one day at a time." But even as I said the words, I wondered how much more proving we'd have to do. Chapter 5. The Empty Nest. Time moved like a river after that, sometimes rushing, sometimes slow, but always carrying us forward towards something I wasn't ready for. One by one, my babies started spreading their wings, and Lord help me, I was proud and heartbroken all at the same time. Caleb was the first to leave, and it nearly killed me. The Army recruiter came by on a Tuesday morning when the boy had just turned 18. I watched from the kitchen window as they talked on the front porch. Saw the way Caleb's eyes lit up when that sergeant spoke about purpose and belonging and making something of yourself. "Mama," he said later. He started calling me Mama somewhere along the way, without fanfare or explanation. "I need to do this. I need to prove I'm worth something." "Caleb Walker," I said, gripping his hands tight, "you don't need to prove anything to anybody. You've been worth something since the day you were born." But I knew that look in his eyes. It was the same look James used to get when he talked about providing for our future family. That fierce determination to be more than what the world expected. So I helped him pack his few belongings into that old duffel bag of his daddy's, and I stood on the porch waving until that bus disappeared around the bend. The house felt different without Caleb's protective presence. Quieter, like we'd lost our watchdog. 2 years later, it was Naomi's turn. My sharp-eyed girl had grown into a beautiful young woman with opinions about everything and the grades to back them up. When that letter came from the University of Mississippi offering her a full scholarship for journalism, I cried right there at the mailbox. "You sure about this, baby girl?" I asked her the night before she left. We were sitting on her bed, surrounded by boxes of books and clothes I'd sewn for her new life. "I'm going to tell our story, Mama," she said, and her voice had that steel in it I'd learned to recognize. "I'm going to tell the world about families like ours, about love that doesn't match what people expect." Joshua went next, my quiet boy, who'd grown into a gentle young man with gifted hands. He'd always been able to fix anything: clocks, bicycles, broken hearts. When Mr. Patterson offered to take him on as an apprentice at his garage, promising to teach him everything about engines and machinery, I knew it was right. Joshua belonged under the hood of a car the same way Naomi belonged behind a typewriter. "You don't have to go if you're not ready," I told him as he loaded his tools into Mr. Patterson's truck. He hugged me with those strong arms that still remembered being 8 and sick. "I'll never be far, Mama, just across town. I'll come for Sunday dinner every week." And he did, faithful as sunrise. But it was Grace leaving that nearly broke me in half. My baby girl had grown into something miraculous, quiet still, but with a mind like a steel trap and a heart that could heal the world. She'd been accepted to Spelman College on a full academic scholarship, and I was so proud I could barely contain it. The night before she left, she found me in the kitchen, crying over a sink full of dishes. "Mama, what's wrong?" I turned to look at this beautiful young woman who'd once been a silent, traumatized child humming lullabies under my porch. Now she stood tall and confident, ready to take on the world. "Nothing's wrong, baby. Everything's right. That's what's breaking my heart." She wrapped her arms around me, and for a moment, she was 5 years old again, whispering "Mama" like it was a prayer. "You know what I'm gonna do when I finish school?" she said. "What's that, sweetheart?" "I'm gonna come back for you, the way you came for all of us. I'm gonna make sure you never have to worry about anything ever again." After they were all gone, the house echoed with memories. I'd walk past Joshua's room and smell motor oil. I'd see Naomi's books still on the shelf and hear her voice arguing some point about civil rights. Caleb's baseball mitt sat on the hall table, waiting for games that wouldn't come. And Grace's piano music was still scattered across the bench, frozen mid-song. At night, I'd sit in James's old recliner and look through photo albums, talking to the empty rooms about my children's accomplishments. Caleb had made sergeant. Naomi was editor of the college newspaper. Joshua was the best mechanic Patterson had ever trained. Grace was studying to be a lawyer, of all things. I was proud. Chapter 6. Framed and Forgotten. 3 years of empty nest living had settled into a routine I'd almost grown comfortable with. I still worked at the church, still tended my garden, still cooked Sunday dinner, hoping one of my children might surprise me with a visit. Joshua came faithfully every week, bless his heart, but the others had gotten busy with their new lives. I understood, even if it stung a little. That's why I was at Patterson's pharmacy that Tuesday evening, picking up arthritis medicine from Mrs. Henderson next door. At 65, my bones complained more than they used to, and carrying groceries for shut-ins was getting harder, but it was good work, Christian work, and it kept me connected to the community that had finally, mostly, accepted our unusual family. The pharmacy was nearly empty when I walked in, just me and old Mr. Charles Whitman, that wealthy businessman who owned half the buildings downtown. He was standing near the prescription counter, looking pale and shaky, arguing with young Danny Patterson about something. "I'm telling you, I need something stronger," Whitman was saying, his voice slurred slightly. "These heart pills aren't working anymore." Danny, who couldn't have been more than 19 and was working alone that night, looked nervous. "Sir, I can't just give you whatever you want. I need a prescription from Dr. Morrison." I minded my own business, collecting Mrs. Henderson's pills and paying quietly while they continued their heated conversation. But as I was leaving, I heard Mr. Whitman's voice getting louder, more agitated. "You listen here, boy. My family built this town. I'm not going to be denied medication by some kid who don't know his place." I glanced back to see Whitman grab something from behind the counter, a small bottle of pills, and storm toward the door. Danny called after him, but the old man was already pushing past me into the parking lot. Now was the last time I saw Charles Whitman alive. 2 days later, Sheriff Williams knocked on my door with a face like thunderclouds. I knew something was terribly wrong the minute I saw him standing on my porch with Deputy Barnes beside him. "Miss Lorraine," he said, removing his hat, "I'm afraid I need to ask you some questions about Tuesday night." "Tuesday night?" "You were at Patterson's pharmacy around closing time. We have you on the security camera." My stomach dropped. "Yes, sir. I was picking up medicine for Mrs. Henderson. Is there some trouble?" "Charles Whitman died that night. Found him in his car outside the pharmacy. Looks like he overdosed on prescription medication." I felt the blood drain from my face. Oh, my Lord, that's terrible. "Here's the thing, Miss Lorraine. Some pills are missing from the pharmacy. Heart medication, pain pills, the kind that could kill someone if they took too many. And you were the only other person in that store Tuesday night." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Sheriff, you don't think I'm hoping you can help us figure out what happened. Danny Patterson says there was an altercation between you and Mr. Whitman." "An altercation?" My voice rose an octave. I barely spoke to the man. He was arguing with young Danny about getting stronger medication. I minded my own business and left. But I could see in Sheriff Williams' eyes that he'd already made up his mind. In a town where Charles Whitman's family had power and influence, and I was just the black woman who'd raised white children, there was only one way this story was going to go. They arrested me the next morning. The trial was a nightmare that stretched over 3 months. The prosecutor, a sharp-faced man named Henderson, who looked at me like I was something he'd scrape off his shoe, painted a picture of a woman who had nothing to lose. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said in his closing arguments, "we have a woman who has spent years living beyond her means, raising children that weren't her responsibility, a woman who works in a church but was willing to steal medication or sell on the street." My lawyer, a tired-looking public defender who seemed to be going through the motions, barely put up a fight. He called no witnesses, presented no alternate theory, just mumbled something about reasonable doubt that convinced nobody. But the worst part wasn't the prosecutor's lies or my lawyer's incompetence. The worst part was the empty courtroom behind me. Day after day, I sat in that defendant's chair watching familiar faces from church and around town avoid my eyes. People who'd eaten at my table, who'd watched my children grow up, who finally learned to call me a friend, they all stayed away. And my children? The 4 people I'd raised to be strong and successful and loyal, they were nowhere to be found. Not one of them came to the trial. Not one of them wrote a letter or made a statement in my defense. On the day of sentencing, as I stood waiting for the judge to decide my fate, I looked back at the gallery one last time Empty rows stretched behind me like a wasteland of broken trust. I had given everything to this town, to those children, to anyone who needed love and hadn't gotten it elsewhere. And when I needed them most, I stood alone.
Chapter 7. The Return in the Courtroom. Judge Harrison was shuffling through his papers, preparing to sentence me to what everyone expected would be life in prison, when the courtroom doors opened with a sound that echoed through my bones like thunder. I didn't turn around at first. 3 months of disappointment had taught me not to hope. But then I heard a voice that made my heart stop, clear, strong, and carrying the authority of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Your Honor, I request permission to address the court. I turned in my chair and nearly fainted. There, walking down the center aisle in a navy blue suit that fit her like armor, was my Grace, my baby girl, now 25 years old and carrying herself like she owned the world. Behind her, filling the previously empty rows, were faces I'd been praying to see for months. Caleb stood at attention in his dress uniform, sergeant stripes gleaming on his shoulders. Joshua had cleaned the motor oil from under his fingernails and wore a suit I'd never seen before. And Naomi, my sharp-eyed girl, sat with a press badge clipped to her jacket and a notebook in her hand, ready to tell the world what was about to happen. "And you are?" Judge Harrison asked, though something in Grace's presence suggested he already knew this wasn't going to be a routine interruption. "Grace Walker, Your Honor, attorney at law, and this woman's daughter." She gestured toward me, and her voice carried across the courtroom like a bell. "I have new evidence that will exonerate my mother completely." The prosecutor, Henderson, shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The defense has already rested their case." "Sit down, counselor," Judge Harrison said, his eyes fixed on Grace with something that might have been respect. "I want to hear what the young lady has to say." Grace moved to the front of the courtroom like she'd been born to stand there. From her briefcase, she pulled out a manila folder thick with documents and what looked like photographs. "Your Honor, 3 days ago, my brother Caleb was cleaning out the apartment of his girlfriend's deceased uncle, a man named Danny Patterson Jr., who worked at Patterson's pharmacy the night Charles Whitman died." I felt my breath catch. Danny Patterson, the boy who'd been working alone that night. "Hidden in Mr. Patterson's belongings, my brother found this." Grace held up a small video camera. "It appears Mr. Patterson was secretly recording his interactions with customers, possibly for his own protection given some of the difficult clientele the pharmacy served." She moved to a small television that had been wheeled into the courtroom. "Your Honor, this video footage shows exactly what happened the night Charles Whitman died." The grainy black and white video filled the screen, and I watched my own figure enter the pharmacy, collect Mrs. Henderson's medication, and pay quietly while staying out of the argument between Whitman and young Danny. But then the camera angle shifted, showing something I hadn't been able to see that night. After I left, Charles Whitman didn't just take 1 bottle of pills, he took 3, shoving them into his coat pockets while Danny was distracted by a phone call. Then, instead of leaving immediately, Whitman went to his car in the parking lot and proceeded to swallow handfuls of pills like candy, washing them down with what appeared to be whiskey from a flask. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of my own breathing. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Grace continued, "we have a signed affidavit from Dr. Morrison confirming that Charles Whitman had been doctor shopping for months, trying to get stronger heart medication than what was safe for someone in his condition. And we have testimony from 3 separate witnesses who will swear that Mr. Whitman had been drinking heavily and talking about ending the pain in the weeks before his death." Henderson was on his feet again, objecting to everything, but his voice sounded weak and desperate. Grace wasn't finished. "Most importantly, Your Honor, we have Mr. Patterson's handwritten confession found with the camera. He admits to letting Mr. Whitman steal the medication because he was afraid of losing his job if he confronted a man with that much power in town. He also admits that he allowed my mother to be blamed rather than risk his own future. She turned to look at me then, and I saw tears shining in her eyes, the same dark eyes that watched me with such trust when she was 5 years old. My mother, Lorraine Walker, has spent her entire life taking care of people who needed her. She took in 4 broken children and loved us back to wholeness. She never asked for recognition or reward. She never expected anything in return except the chance to love us. She saved our lives, Your Honor, and today we're here to save hers. Judge Harrison's gavel came down like the voice of justice itself. Case dismissed. All charges dropped. Mrs. Walker, you're free to go. I collapsed into my chair, 20 years of held breaths finally escaping my lungs.
Chapter 8. A Table for 5. The ride back to my house felt like a dream I was afraid to wake up from. Grace drove her little Honda while I sat in the passenger seat, still wearing the same dress I'd put on that morning, thinking it might be the last time I'd ever choose my own clothes. Through the windshield, I could see Caleb's rental car following behind us, with Joshua and Naomi crowded into the back seat like teenagers again. "Mama," Grace said softly, "I need to tell you why we weren't there before." My throat was still too tight to speak, so I just nodded. The minute we heard about the arrest, we knew something was wrong. You wouldn't steal a paper clip, let alone medication. But we also knew that in a courtroom in Mississippi, with you sitting at that defendant's table, emotion wasn't going to be enough. We needed proof. She pulled into my driveway, and I saw that someone had been taking care of the house. The grass was cut, the flower beds weeded, the porch swept clean. "Joshua's been coming by every day," Grace explained, following my gaze. Naomi used her journalism contacts to investigate Whitman's background. Caleb used his military connections to track down Danny Patterson after he disappeared. And she paused, her voice catching, I dropped everything and moved back home to handle your legal case properly. "You dropped everything." "I deferred my law firm job for a year. This was more important." We sat in the car for a moment, watching as my other 3 children got out and stood looking at the house where they'd grown up. Caleb had filled out since I'd last seen him, carrying himself with the confidence that comes from serving your country. Naomi looked like the professional woman she'd become, but her eyes were still sharp with the intelligence I'd always known was there. And Joshua, my gentle boy, stood with his hands in his pockets, smiling that quiet smile that had always been able to heal whatever was broken. "Come on," Grace said, squeezing my hand. "Let's go home." The front door opened before we reached it, and Mrs. Henderson from next door came bustling out, her arms full of grocery bags. "Oh, thank the Lord," she said, her eyes bright with tears. "Lorraine, honey, I kept telling everyone you didn't do it. I've been stocking your refrigerator every day, hoping—" She trailed off as she took in my 4 children, standing behind me like guardian angels. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson," I managed to say, "for believing." "Child, half this town knew you were innocent. We just didn't know how to put it. But these children of yours?" She shook her head in amazement. "They moved heaven and earth to bring you home." Inside the house, everything was exactly as I left it 3 months ago, except cleaner. Someone had dusted my furniture, organized my kitchen, even put fresh flowers in the vase on the dining room table. "We took turns," Naomi explained, seeing me notice. "None of us could bear the thought of you coming home to a house that felt forgotten." That's when I finally broke down. 3 months of holding myself together, of staying strong through the worst nightmare of my life, and I crumbled like a house of cards.
I sat down hard in James's old recliner and cried until I couldn't breathe. But this time, I wasn't crying alone. Caleb knelt beside the chair, his big hand on my shoulder. Mama, we're so sorry. We're sorry we couldn't be there with you. Sorry you had to go through that by yourself. We never doubted you, Joshua added, his voice thick with emotion. Not for 1 second. We love you, Naomi said simply. We love you, and we're never going to let anyone hurt you again. And Grace, my baby who'd grown into the woman who'd saved my life, sat on the arm of the chair and held my hand like she used to when she was small. You told us once that you thought you saved 4 children. But the truth is, Mama, you saved us every single day. You saved us with love when we didn't know what love looked like. You saved us with patience when we didn't deserve it. You saved us with faith when we couldn't find our own. She gestured around the room at her siblings, and today, finally, we got to save you back. Later that evening, we cooked dinner together in my kitchen, the first time in years that all 5 of us were under the same roof. Caleb stirred the stew while telling us stories about Army life. Naomi set the table with my good dishes, the ones I'd been saving for special occasions. Joshua fixed the squeaky chair that had been bothering me for months. And Grace stood at the sink washing vegetables, humming the same lullaby she'd hummed as a child. As I watched them move around my kitchen with the easy familiarity of people who belonged there, I felt something settle in my chest that had been restless for too long. We were home. All of us. Finally and completely home. You know, I always wondered why God put you 4 on my porch that night. Why? Grace asked. I looked around the table at these beautiful, successful, loving people who'd once been scared, abandoned children, and I smiled. Now I know. He knew that someday I'd be the one who needed saving.
Subscribe to hear more stories like Lorraine's, heartwarming tales that restore your faith in human goodness and remind you that love always finds a way. Perfect for listening while you go about your daily routines, these stories will uplift your spirit and warm your soul. Share them with friends and family who could use a reminder that there's still beauty and hope in this world.